why would the state not want that? And it's this connection to tradition, this connection to heritage, your sense of duty and responsibility that's built up by knowing what your ancestors did and how they thought about things. And the death tax, for example, was around during the early Middle Ages, but it was so hated and caused so many barons' wars and just fighting and violence that the state got rid of it because it wasn't worth the collection fee. They just couldn't deal with it. You have to put your money in something that you expect is going to at least keep up with M2 and preferably outpace it, which leaves you with very few options. A good rule of thumb is that if like all of the wealthy powers that be are doing something and it's not an obvious scam, it's probably for a reason. I think now to see the major country, the hegemon like America, embracing this freedom technology and I think legitimizing it, a combination of investments in income producing assets and bearer assets is probably the way to go. So Bitcoin is just the alpha when it comes to bearer assets.
Guys, welcome back to another show. Today, I'm here with co-founder of the American Tribune, Will. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. What about you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm super excited to have you on the channel. So thank you so much for being with us today. Truly appreciate having you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I've been excited for this conversation.
Likewise. I've seen your podcast with great love, as I was telling you off camera, and you guys touch on some incredible points, which I'm going to dive into it. Before we dive into our chat, though, do you mind to give us an intro and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I was in college when COVID hit, and I was really bored. So I started getting on Twitter and writing on that. You know, some of the fraternity stuff was still active, but school was really slow. So I just had time to spend on Twitter. And through that, I got into law school and was in law school, but wanted to do something else because I was pretty bored. So I started a digital marketing company with a few guys and have been doing that ever since. And as I was wrapping up law school, I realized that I was going to have so much more free time to write about stuff and wanted to find a few topics that are interesting to me, and I've always been a big reader, so I could write about them. And Rhodesia was one that came up, which I spoke about with Breedlove, and then the British gentry and aristocracy was another. And I find both are tied to America pretty well and some of our present problems, along with just Europe's problems generally. And so I wanted to write about those, and was lucky enough to have a few things take off on Twitter, X, I guess we're supposed to call it now. And it was just really cool. So I've been talking about that ever since, and that's kind of become my things, talking about those subjects, writing about them, reading about them, and trying to do my best to help people know about what's going on with those things and why they're relevant to us now.
By the way, guys, as always in the description, you will find Will links. Please make sure to go and check Twitter account. I still call it Twitter, don't worry, X, whatever. It's one of my favorite. I actually follow you extensively, so thank you for pulling out so much good content.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you like it. Yeah, it's a fun place to be, though. It oscillates with time depending on what people want to talk about. But
one question for you right away. So why do we have such a bad money, man?
Yeah, I think it all gets to that root of time sensitivity that Bitcoiners like talking about. I think if you look at old world society, which of course had its flaws, but it was really dominated by people with long time horizons. An example I always go back to is the Percy family, who have been in a ruling position in England for 1,000 years, which is impressive to say the least. I mean, how many people know the names of their great grandparents, much less what it was going back 20 generations ago? So if that's the mindset, and those are the sort of people who are determining monetary policy, you can expect things that are good on a long time horizon, which broadly is hard money of some sort or another, with little variations depending on what's needed by the empire. So you might have gold held in central vaults and then paper money related to it. But broadly, you'll have this hard money, at least as the root of the system, because that's good over a long time horizon. It doesn't impoverish people, nor do those sorts of governments tend to have these just terrible people in charge, people with no idea of what's good, just focused purely on present advantage. But then all that ended really over the course of the 19th century. England's a great example because it was more gradual, where first you have the Great Reform Bill of 1832, which gives voting power to the middle class broadly. And then you kind of have step changes over time where broadly more and more of the population gets a vote until you're in kind of 1860, 1870. And the economy is declining because there's this agricultural depression, and the whole country, more or less, has a vote and is using it to elect just the worst types of people. So instead of having people with long time horizons in charge, you start getting people who are, in their position of power, wealth, status, not because of any long-held assets or ability to accumulate such for future generations if they're new men, but rather people who have it because they've been elected, and so they want to stay elected or keep some bureaucratic office. And when you have those people, they don't have long time horizons. They have extremely short time horizons. At most, it's the next election cycle. Often, it's just the next media cycle. And perhaps their media cycles were slower because it was newspapers instead of cable news or Twitter, but that's still a pretty short time cycle. And so they don't want gold. They're hard money because, well, that's tougher to manage. You have to be a good bit more responsible. You have to think about things. You can't just print it out of thin air. They don't want that because it's a pain. They want money they can just print, which they got away with in World War I and never really went back to a gold standard after that. So you went from this period where roughly from Napoleon to World War I, there was zero inflation. Roughly, I mean, a little bit here or there, but not much at all. To after World War I, you just have this steady devaluation of every currency on Earth, including the dollar. But it's really noticeable with the British pound because it went from being, the world's reserve currency that was super strong to parity with the US dollar today, which is just a disaster for it. So, that's what you get. And I think it's pretty much purely because of the sort of people who flourish in a mass democratic system and the sort of rules, regulations, decrees they create once they're in positions of either a democratic political office or bureaucratic power.
I think what's crazy to me to think about is it's not even that long ago. Like, we're
No.
not talking about thousands of years. We're talking about like a small amount of time and a bunch of bad choices that compounded, like you said, relying on fiat. And how rich people managed to keep their wealth. Definitely, they didn't store fiat, right?
Definitely not. There's a really great book on this that I love going back to. It's called The Aristocracy in England, 1660 to 1914 by J. Beckett, which it's a somewhat dense book, but there's a really good section on it in the middle on aristocratic wealth preservation over that period. So, really from the time feudalism ended in the 1600s to when everything changed with World War One. And, how did these people do it? How did they manage to keep their fortunes intact once there weren't, strict medieval style laws about not being able to sell land or whatever? It was by thinking about things with long time horizons and thinking about, well, even if this doesn't benefit me now, what's the impact going to be 4 generations down the road? And one really clear example of this, and probably the best, just because it's pretty easy to look at, is the Grosvenor family, the Dukes of Westminster, where if you look at them, they own pretty much the entirety of the London neighborhood of Belgravia and about 100 acres of Mayfair, which that's some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. And they've held it for a long time. But if you look at that since late 1600s, and if you look about, how did they develop this? How did they become so wealthy? It wasn't by trying to extract the most possible in like 1680 when they first had control of these farms, neighborhoods. Rather, they used these 99-year leases to have someone else develop it and profit from it in the short term. And that did essentially nothing money-wise for the generation that signed those leases. But then a few generations later, when the grandson was inheriting it and the leases were coming due where they could figure out what they wanted to do with this developed property, it was hugely valuable. And they kept doing that over time, where now the current Duke of Westminster, who I think is the 7th, is the wealthiest peer in England. He's worth like $9 billion. And the Grosvenors have kept doing that. There's a really good article in like The Independent, or, one of those generally terrible UK media publications, that talks about how the Grosvenor Trust, which is how they've structured their money to avoid taxes, they claim not, but that's really the point of it, is able to develop things like malls, or they have this industrial island in Canada that they've developed, or they settled South Africa and Rhodesia, did the same in Australia. How they don't really think about things in terms of how is this going to impact me in the next year, but what income is this going to generate net of taxes 100 years down the road. And that's a really good way to think about things because it enables you to make the best decisions. And really a lot of, particularly the Anglo gentry and aristocracy, whether in America or England or in the colonies abroad, was able to do that or think in terms of decades or centuries rather than quarters like our corporations do. And they're a lot more successful because of it. And so that gets to hard money because particularly if you're operating on a gold standard or something like it, where the money appreciates over time rather than just loses all its value because of inflation, you really need to eventually make a profit. This thing needs to be a valuable expenditure or capital investment. So they've been just much better about that and thinking in terms of benefit for the family rather than just for themselves. And that's been very helpful in how they've managed to hold on to their wealth, prestige, influence, power.
There is a huge difference between an asset and liability, and I think only a few have a clear. There is a book that I mention a lot, which is Rich Dad and Poor Dad from Kiyosaki, that literally changed my life, right? Because I never thought about assets and liability in that angle. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to buy a home that I live into it because it's an investment, which is clearly not. It's a
Yeah,
liability,
yeah.
right? So all these things, they come in only if you dig into it. You touch on taxes. I mean, are taxes necessary?
Yeah, so the state has to do some things, particularly because of scale with current technologies. So when it's just knights fighting and it's really hard to scale that because of supplies, perhaps you could just have these little feudal dominions that are the size of like a neighborhood, where it's the castle and the farms, and they're all fighting with each other all the time. But that doesn't really work once there's, well, first it was longbows with England, but then really with guns, airplanes, all that. You need the combined resources of the state to be able to defend yourselves and keep away the predators, assuming the state isn't itself the predator, which you get into some things there. But assuming you're trying to protect your people from foreign domination, you need the combined resources of the state to do that. How America remained independent, how most of the countries in Europe did the same, though with varying degrees of success for certain periods like the Napoleonic Wars. But regardless, you need that immense scale. So you do need some taxes. I think the question isn't if you need them at all, because in most cases it is, but rather the benefits and downsides of each one. And I think these direct taxes that we've grown accustomed to, particularly direct taxes on land based on what some bureaucrat says the value of it is, income taxes that obliterate any sense of privacy related to financial affairs, and death taxes that tax you for having long time horizons, are disastrous. And they've really only been a thing since like early 1900, really mid 1900 for Americans. It wasn't until FDR that we got a lot of the really bad effects of this, and England was a decade or two ahead of us on that front. But those aren't particularly traditional. The death tax, for example, was around during the early Middle Ages, but it was so hated and caused so many barons' wars and just fighting and violence that the state got rid of it because it wasn't worth the collection fee. They just couldn't deal with it. And it was one of the most hated taxes. And you really get that in America now, where because of certain exemptions, most people don't pay death taxes, but they hate the idea of it. It's just one of the most hated taxes. And then property taxes, pretty much everyone pays in some form or another. And those are hated too. Even if it's relatively small, the idea that your home isn't yours because the state says so is infuriating to a lot of people and is not traditional. So those are terrible. I think indirect taxes, by which I don't mean inflation, and I had to clarify that with Breedlove, but tariffs, kind of excise taxes, fees for stamps, like stuff like that, because it can be avoided if you do have to economize and not buy the things that there are high sales taxes on. People don't dislike them as much, even if they end up paying more via sales tax than with exemptions they do with income tax, or whatever. They just, it's not painful in the same way. And I think people understand the justice of it and the need of it more than with the direct taxes like an income tax or something on that front.
I don't know how you feel about this, but when people say, oh, tax the rich and solve the problems, I'm like, guys, what?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's generally at this point the honest people who pay taxes. So there are always ways around it if you're creative enough. But typically that's just like the worst people who are profiting off that, like the gangsters or drug dealers. Of course, those people don't pay taxes because they're not going to do anything legally. But if you look at, say England's just an example I go back to because it's a little bit easier to understand, smaller than America, but easier for Americans at least to understand than the continent. If you are, say the Manners family, the Dukes of Rutland, they own this beautiful castle called Beaver Castle, and you have to pay taxes on that because you can't just leave. It exists, so if you want to keep it, the state knows it's there and they're going to tax it. And it's just painful, extortionate levels of taxation where it's like the state doesn't want this family to own this home, despite it being in their family's history since William the Conqueror, really. Which, why would the state not want that? And it's this connection to tradition, this connection to heritage, your sense of duty and responsibility that's built up by knowing what your ancestors did and how they thought about things. And so I think the rich do pay taxes kind of depending on who they are, where it's often just the people who you read about in the news that you detest, like the Sackler family, where they'll get away with not paying taxes because it's some modern art scam. Whereas the people who I think do want to do good and do want to help their community often do pay taxes because it's connected to the real world. And so the state knows about it and is able to tax it a little bit better.
Sometimes I wonder, which is another rabbit hole, where the monies then are going, right? Because I don't think paying taxes is the problem itself. The problem is like, where are the money that people pay taxes into getting distributed for, right? Like, good luck in the UK having the healthcare provided by the government.
Right.
You don't want to go down that route. So at the end of the day, it's interesting. And do you see Bitcoin as a savior, as a new gold? What's your angle?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the problem to be overcome with it, and the different people who are able to talk about this better than I, is that since it doesn't produce an income, it's just you're counting on capital appreciation. You have to sell it to get the benefit of holding it, which makes it not permanent in the way that say Chevron has been for the Rockefeller family, or a landed estate has been for the English nobility. Those can produce income for centuries, so they can be held for centuries. Whereas Bitcoin, if you want to profit from it, you have to sell it. That said, there are a great many benefits, and the same is true of gold. So I think bearer assets, except for bonds, which don't bearer bonds don't really exist anymore, just have that issue in that they don't produce an income. But other than that, I think Bitcoin is hugely useful because it allows you to just leave if you want. They can't stop you from selling it so long as you're kind of not engaging with the banking system. They can't stop you from leaving with it because you can just remember words in your head. It appreciates wildly because everyone, or a lot of people, get those benefits, and increasing more people are understanding those benefits. And there are jurisdictions that are very friendly to it, and probably will continue being so. El Salvador, the UAE, other states, kind of that sort, that want to attract people, want to attract capital, and understand that people hate paying taxes on stuff like this. So I think Bitcoin has a huge number of benefits. I don't think it's I don't think it's a one-shot solution, but I do think it's a necessary part of whatever solution we do find, is having something like this that's digital. So it's really hard to control. Whereas gold can be faked, gold can be controlled just because it weighs something, so it's hard to cart around. So I think Bitcoin has a huge number of benefits.
It does make sense because it's like a young teenager, a naughty teenager, and we need to understand what to do with it. But I think at some point we'll see many businesses starting to allow to borrow against your Bitcoin. I mean, we've seen a bunch so far, didn't work out really well. I know there is a few out there. They are kind of semi-legit. I mean, Sailor is doing something similar with strategy. We've seen 21 with Jack Muller. We've seen also Nakamoto from Dave Bailey reveal the other day they want to do another Bitcoin company. So I think we're going to see a lot of businesses building on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are two things there. One is that even ignoring the yield thing, it's hugely helpful to have an asset that tends to sop up excess M2. So we know governments are going to print money because there's no constraint on their doing so. So if you expect your dollar to be devalued, put your money in something that you expect is going to at least keep up with M2 and preferably outpace it, which leaves you with very few options. One is real estate, which, unless it's held at scale, isn't it's kind of hard to deal with. If you just have a couple houses you're renting, you're probably not doing great generally. Second, you have stocks, but the problem with stocks is there are companies underlying them, and a lot of those companies are just terrible. We saw this, for example, in 2021. I don't know if you saw the Bloomberg report, but only 6% of new hires after kind of COVID and the Floyd protests were white men, which is not their percentage of the population. And if you look at kind of competence statistics, it's seemingly quite detrimental for companies to have the hiring policies they do. So, do you really want to invest in those companies? Similarly, if they're all in on the ESG thing, like if a company is against using oil, solar power isn't that efficient, and nuclear power hasn't been built out enough where you can get away from oil. So, if a company is ideologically opposed to something in a way that's detrimental to profits, do you really want to invest in it? But a lot of the S&P 500 is. So that's a problem where I think it's hard to count on these companies long term. And then you have gold, which has its uses, but it's very inefficient to deal with. Like if you're trying to sell an American Eagle to a gold dealer, you're probably not going to do great on that transaction. And the friction there, I think, is a huge reason why people don't really like holding gold. But then on the other hand, you can't count on the gold ETFs to, actually hold gold. They're probably lying about it. It appears that they were lying about it if you kept up with the gold situation in London. It's a mess. So you can't count on those either, which really leaves Bitcoin is the only thing outside of few exceptions for very wealthy families that's going to keep up with inflation, outpace the dollar's decline. So I think people are going to build on that because really they have to, because it's one of the few options and probably the best of the options.
Whoever said Bitcoin has no utility has never found himself or herself in a situation where they need Bitcoin in the first place. Like when I moved from London to Dubai, I had a position in gold. Okay, let's think about this for a second. First of all, I did not have my gold. Someone else had my gold. So you have to trust someone, a third party. They have your gold secured into a cavo, which then turns out to be empty, but that's a separate problem. And then I just can't go to the airport with 2 bags or plastics full of gold and say, hey guys, Abibi, I'm going to Dubai. They don't let me
Yeah,
do that. Whether with Bitcoin, like you said, you remember your seed phrase and you go wherever you want to go. So that's a utility right there. Not mentioning the fact
yeah,
that it's in your hands, like, and you own it. I mean, if stored
yeah,
properly, right? Because if you leave it on Coinbase, well, then that's not yours. It's a different story.
yeah.
I wanted to ask you this. I mean, where do you think banks are going to pivot into? Because now they are clearly embracing the fact that Bitcoin is growing as digital gold. There is a digital commodity. And I mean, they have to do something in their services to make people wanting to deposit Bitcoin to them, right? Because that will be a missed opportunity otherwise, don't you think?
Oh yeah, I think there are a couple things going on there. One is I think regulation was changed recently that allows them to count crypto they hold as an asset on the balance sheet rather than a liability, which will probably be a big change. I think the other thing though that kind of makes them resistant to change is that you still have to pay taxes in dollars or whatever the fiat currency of your state is. So people are going to have to keep fiat in the bank in some way. And I think banks are just counting on that, where they know people, well, if you want to pay your property taxes, pay your income taxes, buy something at McDonald's, you're probably going to use fiat. And so you have to keep that in your bank account. And I think they're holding on to that, but we'll see how long it lasts because people don't want to do that because it's devalued. So I think there are conflicting things there. On one hand, they can do this, and the smarter ones will try to. I think on the other hand, people have to hold fiat, and there's some hesitance to deposit crypto anywhere because there's a sense that it's a scam because it's been a scam pretty much everywhere that's been tried. So I think they're competing things. I think the best case scenario would be seeing people move beyond banks and beyond paying people to steal their money. So we'll see how it works out. But I think the long term prognosis is quite bad for most of the banking system.
People are complaining, oh, Bitcoin is too late. I'm like, guys, do you remember in 2017, banks used to block me. I used to bank with HSBC in the UK. They froze my account because I wanted to withdraw money to buy Bitcoin on Coinbase, right? Which those are two of the most legit names. I mean,
Yeah.
questionable, but they are well regulated as opposed to other exchanges or other banks. I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm giga bullish on the idea of having an American president saying, I mean, besides the fact that he launched a couple of meme coins, which is another rabbit hole, but how can you be bearish at this point?
Oh yeah, I think the big benefit is that it's a freedom technology. For example, I always go back to the Gilded Age, but if you look at the state of things, in 1890 or whenever, when imperialism is at its peak, where a lot of these places are places you can visit, you could show up with British sovereigns, buy something, get change in German marks or French francs, and go purchase something else in another country. And there weren't these capital controls. It was all gold, so it was all usable and pretty easy to exchange. And you could just do what you wanted. You could walk around with your pocketbook full of sovereigns or eagles or whatever it was, and it was fine. It worked really well. And the world was a freer place because of that, because you didn't have to deal with, whatever money change or is stealing your money, or didn't have to deal with that. And that was a very free world. That all changed with World War I and the fiat system. But I think now to see the major country, the hegemon like America, embracing this freedom technology and I think legitimizing it in a lot of normal people's eyes, just because, well, it's America doing this. I think that's hugely beneficial because the state of things in a world where you can just walk around with your money and use it to whatever extent you want, where aren't these controls on pulling it out of the bank. You're not getting a text from your credit card company saying you're not allowed to buy that because we said so. It could be fraud. There's just so many benefits attached to that I think are hugely helpful and really pro freedom in a way that we haven't seen in over a century.
How do you feel about El Salvador? Because it feels like they are pioneering slash experimenting, right? Because they are smaller, they can. Do you think A, everyone is watching, and B, is it going to succeed? What's your two satoshis on El Salvador?
I think everyone is watching. I think both El Salvador and America are being watched for different reasons. One is that El Salvador has just pioneered saying, well, actually, we don't have to do things this way and we're going to do them better, whether that's locking up all the gangsters who worship Satan and are murdering people in human sacrifices along with normal crime and saying, well, these people actually don't have to control your neighborhood. We're just going to put them in jail and everyone will be far better off because of that. Or saying, well, America has been quite tyrannical with how it's used the dollar and dollar trades and sanctions and embargoes and all this stuff. So what if we just use the thing where none of that can happen? What if we use Bitcoin? And I think Bitcoin has really enabled it to pursue whatever domestic policies it wants because it can send money abroad and receive money. And it's it's free because of that. So El Salvador, I think, is being watched by people who want to escape the boot heel of the globalist American empire. I think America's being watched because it would be a huge change for America to say, even just we accept that Bitcoin will be used in transactions instead of the dollar. I think that would be a massive change. And I think a lot of people would, for one, just be more comfortable with America because of that, because it's away from this financial tyranny, but also would, I think, see Bitcoin as a more legitimate asset and way to transfer assets than they did beforehand, because it's the hegemon accepting it. I think there's just so much going on there, but I think most of it is quite positive.
I have the feeling that the stable coins are going to play a crucial role in the next 6 to 12 months. And I think
Mm-hmm.
they are going to use, and by they I mean the Trump administration, they're going to use them to vitalize the dollar, because it's such an easy
Mm-hmm.
play to extend the dollar dominance. You can literally send money to anyone with a cell phone, right? Whether there are parts in Africa or in South America or in South Africa where there is the people don't even have a bank account. Kind of two questions into one. But first part is about the stable coins, but second part is, I don't know how long the dollar has into, before it's going to collapse, because it's been a minute since the dollar has been around, right?
Yeah, I think there are a few things there. One is the like ability to transfer money as you want is hugely beneficial. And you mentioned South Africa. I don't know if you've seen it, but South African farmers, the Boers, are becoming refugees, where they're leaving because of the farm murders and all this horrible, just evil government policy to America. But South Africa has extremely strict capital controls, where you can't take more than like $1,000 or something out of the country if it's via a bank. Whereas if you hold Bitcoin or temporarily even a stable coin, what they can't stop you. You can just leave and remember the words, and you're good to go. And then you can translate your wealth into something in America or wherever you want to go, which is hugely beneficial. The second thing, though, is I think the government loves stable coins because people are going to, the stable coin companies have to buy U.S. bonds, whether it's treasuries, T-bills, or T-bills, treasury bonds, et cetera, like all the different types, to fund their operations and keep it stable. So America's great for that because they have all this debt that needs to be rolled over. So it'll help out a lot. And also just having people use the dollar nominally, digitally, is a good thing for America abroad. I think the problem, though, is you can't hold these stable coins because it's the same problem as a bank, where they can always just cut you off and say, well, you're not allowed to use it because we've deemed you a racist or a terrorist or something. So no more money for you, which they can't do with Bitcoin, but they can do with stable coins. So I think people who think about it won't hold stable coins long term, but the benefits of them are immense, at least compared to credit cards, PayPal, the banking system. It's great to be able to transfer money as you want, so long as you're able to do it. So I think there will be pushbacks against stablecoin adoption, but to a large degree, it'll continue to expand. It'll be good for the dollar because the dollar is, as you mentioned, getting weaker. The good thing for it, though, is that if you look at the euro, or if you look at the pound, or if you look at the renminbi, probably with the exception of the ruble, just because of current geopolitical circumstance, all the other currencies are far worse than the dollar. Whatever you think of American politicians, and they are bad, the Europeans are just so much worse, or the Communist Chinese Party is perhaps more prudent, but in the tyranny angle, a lot worse. It's just there's not a competitor that's nationally created, so the dollar has that going for it. But these private market potential offerings are, I think, a lot better than the dollar.
There's no scenario in which I'm going back to Europe. I mean, Europe is cooked.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
the UK, which was, I mean, it's been by far my favorite place. I mean, okay, now it's not even in the European Union, whatever, but geographically speaking, it's there. It's like Switzerland.
Mhm.
They are there, but they're not there.
Right.
Still was a fantastic place to be. I mean, compared to many other places in Europe. And now when I look into it, I'm like, oh my, this is not looking good. And it's getting
Mhm.
worse. Like you said, it's not getting any better. A few bad decisions, they compound, and a decade could feel extremely painful. So we touch on the Trump. I mean, are they really truly good for America? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think if you look at what's good for America, it's this national system of political economy. I know Adam Smith is championed a lot in capitalist circles, but if you look at Friedrich List, I think his work is really the one that countries that succeeded adopted, whether it was the Asian tigers, China, Germany, and Japan before World War One, America from really Hamilton until the late Gilded Age. It was this system of using tariffs to not keep out foreign products, but ensure that domestic products would be competitive, and then invest the proceeds in infrastructure so that they can get more competitive and building on that. So I think Trump has the potential to be hugely beneficial for America, but there will be a detox stage and we'll have to stick with it, which Americans haven't been great about before. So we'll see how it goes. But Trump, I think, has the potential to be this McKinley type figure where we reestablish our old system and become nationally prosperous because of it. And you mentioned the UK. It's a great example of the opposite side of that, where people don't know this, but until kind of the mid-Victorian period, England had very high tariffs, and they're probably what enabled it to be this industrial revolution superpower where no one could keep up with it for a while. Then with free trade, all that was obliterated, and it really impoverished the country. If you look at what happened in World War II, where they needed these destroyers, they needed these planes, they needed these tanks, they needed the engines for all of it, and they didn't have the domestic industry to produce those because they'd been put out of business by American and German competitors. So they had to buy them from America. And because of our laws at the time, we made them pay in gold. And so all of Britain's gold, even wedding rings, were taken off fingers and given to the state so that it could buy American weapons. Britain was left impoverished by that war pretty much because it didn't have domestic industry. And now people think of Britain or England as a wealthy place, but its per capita GDP is lower than Mississippi, and everyone in America thinks of Mississippi as just this extremely backwards place that, is nice in some ways, but has a lot of problems, and it's richer than England on an average basis. So England was really hurt by this free trade type policy of the sort that people continue pushing today. I think people without much of an understanding of history. So I think it would be very beneficial for Trump to take America back to what used to be called the American system. It was developed by Hamilton and then Clay, and it's the system of domestic industry, domestic infrastructure, and really caring about national flourishing and prosperity rather than just optimizing for supposed efficiencies.
Where do you see a European Union, and not just the European Union, but where do you see us going in 10 years? Because so far, it doesn't look great, right?
It's so bad. I think the migrant crisis and kind of the problems resultant from it will be the easiest thing for them to solve, though still very difficult, just because they can deport these people. So there's the potential that that will be fixed. It's something approaching a reasonable time horizon, and there's so much public anger over it that maybe it will be fixed. I think the bigger thing for Europe is just energy. There's no such thing as a country with low baseload power that's also wealthy. And every European country, with kinda the exception of France, has obliterated baseload power in the name of these green energies that aren't green or renewable. So if you're Britain, which is cloudy like 95% of the year, and you're building out solar power, that's just an absurd decision, particularly when natural gas turbines exist that are nearly zero emissions, and nuclear turbines exist that are actually zero emissions. And you could just build those and have a great amount of power. But none of them have done that. France did that in the 70s, and it's decaying now. Germany is blowing up its nuclear plants and replacing them with solar power and coal, which is just insane. It's a huge problem for them, and it takes so long to build these plants that really they're in huge degree of trouble now. England's a great example, particularly England rather than Britain as a whole, because they've invested so much per year in solar that just 1 year of it would have been enough to build natural gas plants that would power the country and have electricity as cheap as it is in America. They didn't do that. They built solar. And it's such a problem now that British industry, what remained of it, is entirely uncompetitive. Where a couple months ago, you had Britain's leading industrialist talking to, I forget which media outlet, I think it was the Telegraph, about how he simply can't afford to keep his plants open because energy is so expensive. And at the point where you have that, you're just going to become an even poorer society, and there's no real hope of success unless you start building these things immediately, which they're not doing because of this ideology they're so committed to. So yeah, I really think Europe's future is dark in both senses of the word, just that not much hope, and they're probably going to run out of power, which is going to be a huge problem for them. So yeah, I would not invest in the continent or England right now. It's just a very dire situation, and I don't see them being willing to solve it, particularly the power issue.
And then you put the cherry on the cake, which is AI, and oh boy, then it's going to come in probably in the worst moment. I think there's going to be a lot of people, they are going to be in trouble financially, and maybe that's the plan. I don't know. Maybe there is a universal salary plan. They want to put people on an income, a universal income, so that they can control them finally completely. And if you don't behave like I say, I'll pull the plug and I don't pay you anymore.
Yeah, it's dark. The other thing in Europe is, as you mentioned, just this like this welfare system that they've grown so accustomed to that really they can't afford anymore. I mean, not only have they had no kids, which is a problem because there's no workers to support the program, but those workers that do exist, there aren't enough resources to pay for this. It's so they're going to need to recapitalize their countries somehow. I think the ways they could do that are either not going to happen, which is free markets, building nuclear power, kind of promoting domestic industry. None of that's going to happen. So the only other ways are just, you can think about the consequences. They're just horrible. It's what Europe went through in the kind of first half of the 20th century. And it was all just unspeakably awful, whether communism, fascism, English domestic socialism, where they confiscated everything. It's all just so dark, and they'll probably try and do it again. So I would not invest in the continent or England right now.
What do you think is the solution here? How would you protect yourself for the next 10 years coming forward?
Yeah, so if you're an individual, which most people are listening to this are individuals rather than leaders of nation states, I assume. So if you're an individual, I really think a combination of investments in income producing assets and bearer assets is probably the way to go. So Bitcoin is just the alpha when it comes to bearer assets. It's really good on that front. So that's a great thing. And then on the other hand, whether it's a private investment locally or dividend stocks or whatever it is based on your personal situation, I think things that can produce an income and do so stably are a good idea just because they give you a little bit of maneuver room where you're probably not going to die or have to sell off everything, which is how the wealthy peers survived in England. There's this not to go too down a rabbit hole, but I find it interesting. There's this really good paper published by Cambridge called Trajectories of Aristocratic Wealth. Forget the time period they give, but they make the point that the old Anglo-Norman peers, so the ones whose families came across with William the Conqueror in 1066, they're largely both still around and still wealthy. And if you look at how they did it, it's by having enough income producing assets to keep going even when taxes were high, so they could deal with the situation and they had a good bit of maneuver room. Whereas the families that got peerages under the late Victorian period or the Edwardian period, where he just handed those out to wealthy people, they're all broke. They've all lost their money completely. They did so in a couple generations, and it's because they spent too much. They weren't thinking about things for the long term, and it's been a problem for them. And the data is very clear on how the different strategies work. So I would say thinking about things that are give you some degree of local power, local income, that sort of thing, it can be hugely beneficial. But you also want the bearer assets, so you can just leave if the state gets too tyrannical. I think for nation states, Singapore's a great example. China and Japan are good examples. If you read Lee Kuan Yew's book From Third World to First and see how Singapore succeeded, it was the same thing but applied nationally. So thinking about huge levels of domestic investment, domestic infrastructure build out, tariffs that keep things away so that your local industries can become competitive. That really worked quite well for East Asia after World War II. It was hugely successful. It's not popular now because it doesn't go along with this free trade orthodoxy, but it worked just fabulously. And there's this degree of kind of rootedness and attachment to one's people that is also unpopular now, but I think really helped make Singapore, which is multi-ethnic, a success story because they thought of themselves as Singaporeans and wanted to build something for their children's children. And you just don't see that in, like, America now or England now or wherever now. It's kind of gone by the wayside. But you think things like that, thinking about the long term and trying to build things that are going to help your grandchildren flourish, I think that needs to be the mindset for individuals and for states.
It goes back to the beginning, right? Think long term as opposed to short term, right? And I found it fascinating. We have this thing, we have this asset, and people are buying dogs memes, and I'm like, how is it even possible? Like, I really don't get it.
Yeah, it's nonsense. One other thing from history, if just for me to mention it, is the dog meme speculation reminded me of this. If you read about how investments panned out over the course of the Gilded Age, we have all this money flowing into everything. Very little of it actually worked, particularly if you just compare it against, not that you should buy government bonds, but just compare it against kind of the risk-free rate of government bonds. None of it really was a success story. I mean, all of the American railroad companies, with the exception of like two, were scams that just defrauded investors. Most of the attempts at developing like seaborne resorts in England were just messes. There are all these things that people speculated on, the South Sea bubble, where they were told that there was going to be this great success, that it was the reasonable thing to do was to speculate on this, and it was all just a complete disaster. So I really do think that this idea of prudence and thinking about, actual control over things for the long term, where you can, most people don't defraud themselves. So if you can think about something where you're able to, just avoid wasting money. I think that's really important to thinking about investment wise and speculation wise. Even if you're convinced you're going to be the next meme coin speculator that makes $1 gazillion, you're just not. So it makes more sense to buy the risk free thing, which for this would be Bitcoin. It's a lesson of history investment wise.
100%. Thank you so much for saying it. And also on Bitcoin itself, who cares about 80,000, 100,000? This thing is going up. Like in 10 years from now, it's not going to be $100,000. So why would you wait like a 20% correction before you go? Just buy good stuff for a long period of time. You'll be okay. But then when I think about it, could it be a distraction? Could it be the bread and circus the Roman invented to just keep people off? I was reading an article this morning. There is like 7 times the amount of Bitcoin have been acquired in the past 7 days compared to the miners they've produced. So this thing is going, like, companies, like they say, if you follow the money, they are scooping up like there is no tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a great point, and there are 2 angles there. One is that a good rule of thumb is that if like all of the wealthy powers that be are doing something and it's not an obvious scam, it's probably for a reason. You kind of got that with land investment up until the mid-19th century. You got it with equity investment afterward. There are things that people do for a reason. So there's probably a reason that everyone who's wealthy has developed some exposure to Bitcoin, with the exception of just the very old, like Warren Buffett. But that's kind of different. The other thing, though, is that it's, I think, very scary and dangerous for BlackRock to be buying up so much Bitcoin. BlackRock in particular, Fidelity and Vanguard, if you look at their like ESG voting record, we're actually pretty good on not doing that and just voting for what was good for shareholder returns in terms of like their custodial ETF assets that were voting for people. Whereas BlackRock has just been this force for evil for as long as ESG has been a thing. And I think that's potentially quite bad for Bitcoin because, say they did own enough to be a major power. They could say that the BlackRock Bitcoin is only going to be related to nodes or miners that are powered by renewable sources, which would be a mess and a catastrophe. But potentially they could do it. So I do think not your keys, not your coins. If you really need to buy an ETF for price exposure and something, maybe that kind of makes sense. So you should be prudent about which one you pick. But it's far better to control it yourself so that you can not be exposed to BlackRock trying to screw the whole thing up with some insane ideological idea. I think it's worrisome.
Super well said. I completely agree. I also worry about the in-kind redemption. That's a major problem because then what happens when I sell my Bitcoin, right? I'm getting cash, but are they selling? We don't even know how many they have. There's a lot of potential problems / issues there. And again, like you said, you have the option to acquire the asset. Bear, just get the asset, right? It's not that difficult, right? Go and read a couple of books, like you lead the example, such a fantastic history lesson you gave us today. So educate yourself, get your custody, acquire solid assets. That's how you fight bad times. Super well said. But Will, man, I could stay here with you all day. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. We definitely have to do it again. I really enjoy having you on the channel.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. And for those listening, he rescheduled around me getting married and was very flexible with the timeline. So I really appreciate that. It was a ton of fun coming on. I appreciate the opportunity and great talking to you. This was wonderful.
Of course, and congrats on getting married again. Send you my love. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Are you going to be in Vegas for the conference?
No, I was just in Vegas for my bachelor party, and I need a detox period before I go back to that place.
Fair enough.
so I won't be. Maybe next year.
Fantastic. I'm sure we'll bump into each other. But as always, guys, I will leave in the description. You must follow Will on Twitter if you don't, or X, whatever, if you don't already, because he's one of the best accounts there is out there. So again, a link in the descriptions. But thanks, man. An absolute pleasure having you. We'll be in touch, okay? Speak soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Fantastic. Bye. Bye-bye.